Hello, and welcome to Day 5 of 28 Days to Better Chess Tactics. In this video, we're going to cover double checks, and also I'll give a quick review of the four-part thought process that I should clarify so that you can use it when you're going through all the tactical positions. Okay, so the first step in the thought process is to find all of your opponent's threats. So, for example, if we look in this position, step 1 would be, if it's white to move, to notice all of black's threats, which he has quite a few here. The knight is threatening the bishop, the queen is threatening the bishop, and plus the bishop's pin to the king, so we can't even move the bishop. We see that we have this discovery here, so we'll definitely need to investigate that, but that's step 2. So once you see all of the threats, and you should also notice the material balance. So we're way behind in material, we're behind a queen. So we need to either win a huge amount of material or to checkmate the opponent. So in step 2, basically you want to look for all the forcing moves. You want to look for all the checks, captures, and threats. And you want to do that by finding all the candidate moves for each piece, namely the king, and the queen if there is one, the rooks, the bishops, knights, and then the pawns. And you can use this method to quickly discount moves that don't have anything to do with a forcing sequence. Now, in a tactical position, it's quite clear cut. You know, you're trying to find a win. You know, you're trying to find a forcing continuation. So, in a real game, you don't. So that's why you want to train it as a comprehensive thought process. So part 3 is to calculate the candidate moves. So here, we can see that rook check, also rook coming back, checks anywhere, or rook takes pawn. So we have multiple moves with the rook, but we should notice that the bishop is pinned, and so unless we give a double check, that our bishop will be captured and will be down too much material and will be lost. So the only double check we have is rook takes h7, and rook to g8. So we need to just look at those two moves to figure out which is the strongest. So rook takes h7, king takes h7, that's the end of the forcing line. We don't have any more checks, and our bishop's pinned, so that's losing. So we can discount that move. Now rook to g8 pretty much forces the king to step over because the rook can't take because it's a double check. And we see we'll have pretty much only one more move, which is rook to g1. And because there's no interposition, the queen can't come in because the pawn blocks it. And there's no other move, this square is covered by the bishop. It's checkmate, so it's game over. So step 4, since we've determined our move from the initial position, is you want to visualize your move, which is rook to g8, and you want to make sure all the forcing replies don't lead to you losing. So we want to visualize this position and look at all the forcing replies. Well, as we already looked at, we know that pretty much only the king can take, and then you want to visualize this position. And since there's no interposition, we can pretty much verify for ourselves that it's not a blunder, rook to g8 is not a blunder, and that we could play it. So that's the four-part thought process. All right, we're going to move on to position 1, and I hope you use the four-part thought process to try to solve it, although you can just try to find any checks, captures, and threats and do a blunder check. That works as well. In position 1 here, it is white to move, and you could see that black has a lot of threats, so I would definitely use step 1 of the four-part thought process in this position, but I'll give you a second here to solve it, and it is white to move. Okay, so if we look at this position, we could see that black is threatening checkmate in a lot of ways. This isn't necessarily checkmate, the queen can take, but he loses the queen. Now, this bishop is bearing down on this diagonal, so we can't even take this rook. And it's another situation where black has a huge material advantage basically we have 2 minor pieces and a queen, and black is up essentially 2 rooks and a minor piece. So it's another tactical situation where we have to use specifically a double check to win the game. And in this position, we pretty much only have 1 check. The queen could take in multiple ways, so we'll have to look at those, but we can easily discount queen takes f7, just rook takes. We can easily discount queen takes g6, it looks ridiculous. But, you know, in this stage, you still need to look at every move, even though it seems ridiculous. And the reason we have to do a check in this position is because if we don't make a completely forcing move, if we just make some threat, for example, if we bring the knight in, then it's not forcing enough. He can just simply checkmate us and game over. We also have a check here. So we pretty much have 2 checks that we need to look at. Queen to g7 and queen to h8. So if we look at queen to g7, we see that it forces the king to step on to this diagonal where we have a double check. So we can bring the knight in multiple ways. And so we need to look at both of those. Normally you want to look at the most forward continuation. But of course, even though it's a double check, it allows the king an escape square. So we can discount that, although there's a check here. At this point, the king has escaped and we don't have any more moves. So we'll look at the other double check, which is knight to f5. Now that does cover this square, and because the bishop's cutting through, the king has to step back, and we can deliver checkmate because the h6 square is not covered. So we found a way to checkmate, that's good. We should also look at queen to h8, if the king takes. Well, that doesn't really lead to anything because either way, if we move here, then it's not a double check, and so black can simply interpose on this diagonal, and now we don't have a checkmate. So we can determine that queen to g7 is winning, but we should blunder check it. So you visualize this position, and then you just make sure that after knight to f5, that there's really no escape square. And there isn't, so we just play it and win. Alright, on to position 2. Alright, in position 2 here, it is white to move, and so I'll give you a second just to pause the video and solve it here. Okay, so in this position, you can see that it's pretty much out of the opening, and we have quite a limited range of candidate moves because pretty much all our pieces are on the 1st rank and all blacks are on the 8th rank, so we're not really developed. I just want to make a quick point that when you're searching for forcing moves in the opening, you need to be very objective because it's very easy to just start a premature attack while you're not developed. If you search for forcing moves that you think win, you need to really double check. Otherwise, you could just always make a normal move, such as developing a rook or developing another piece, your bishop. So I just want to make a point of that. But here in this position, we pretty much have the knight moving forward and the bishop taking on f7, check. So those are the forward forcing moves that increase your activity, and so we'll investigate those. We see that if we bring the knight in and check, it looks like it's discovering with the bishop and the queen, but the problem is the knight can take back and it's covering this f7 square, and now checkmate doesn't work. So And it's the same situation for knight to e5, and actually the knight could take, but we'll just stop there. So the only other forcing move is bishop takes f7, and we see that after the king takes, it allows a double check, either knight to d6 or knight to e5. So we should visualize each knight move and try to figure out the difference. So when you're analyzing, or when you're calculating, you want to look at the most forward move first. So if we look at knight to d6, we need to figure out what moves the black king has. So black king can pretty much only go to f6 or to g6, but either way, it's checkmate there. Same for knight to e5. There's pretty much only knight to f6 or knight to g6. So we can determine that both knight moves are pretty much the same. They result in a checkmate. So you just play one of them. We'll choose knight to e5 because the knight and the queen are hitting the king, and that'll be over. So we'll move on to position 3 now. Position 3 is white to move, and basically you want to look for all the forcing moves again. Alright, so just take a second, pause it, and try to solve it. So this is a very thematic position, and even though white does have a material advantage with the knight and the queen, it could still be quite a challenge to finish black off, because 2 rooks and the pawn advantage could really throw a thorn into white's side. But here he uses a double check, even though the rook is threatening the queen, to pretty much force a checkmate. So after this double check, with the knight hitting the king and the queen hitting the king, if the king moves here, then it's pretty much checkmate on f7. Now if the king moves back, then we can use an interesting mating pattern called a smothered mate, where the queen moves forward here, the rook takes, and then checkmate on f7. Alright, moving on to position 4. In position 4 here, it is black to move, so just take a second and try to solve the position. Okay, so in this position we can see first off that white is threatening the queen. Now just because you see a threat doesn't mean you shouldn't look for forcing moves. You certainly should. So a capture that you'll notice right away is simply taking the rook, which definitely needs to be investigated here. So the other candidate moves pretty much are just to move the queen or to interpose, which doesn't solve anything because then white could just simply threaten the bishop. But there's actually the threat of a double check here. So if the queen takes the rook and white takes the queen, then it opens the file here where we can check with both the bishop and the rook. And because of that, white can't interpose with either the bishop or the queen or this bishop. And because of that, the king has to move over and we get a checkmate. So because of that threat, white chooses not to recapture. And if he just takes, for example, here, then we can even take with the bishop hitting this pawn, and now there's actually a pin, and the pawn can't take the queen. So it's important to remember that sometimes the threat of a tactic can actually lead to another tactic or winning material because they can't meet the threat. Alright, moving on to the last position. Alright, position 5 here, and it is white to move, so just take a second and try to solve it for yourself. Alright, so if we look at this position, we can see that it's apparent that white is attacking the king side. I just want to point out, first off, that the reason he's doing that is because black is really undeveloped on the queen side, which means all his pieces are just sitting here. And because of that, it gives white a greater number of pieces on the king side. We can see that pretty much it's just the rook and the king versus the queen, 2 knights, and 2 bishops. And because of that, white can even sacrifice his queen and checkmate black. So when you're evaluating tactical positions, it's important to keep in mind that it's not just the amount of pieces on the board total, but also the position of those pieces. Alright, so there's pretty much 2 candidate moves in this position. There's check here and queen takes. So if we look at the check here, we see it doesn't really result in anything because the knight can come back. So that pretty much just leaves us with evaluating queen takes h7. So if queen takes h7, the king takes, pretty much forced. There's 2 moves here. There's a double check along here with the knight to either g5 or f6. So if we look at knight to f6, we can see that because this bishop is covering this square, and if the knight goes to f6, he'll be covering this square, the king can only go back here. So we need to visualize, and this is the hard part about working with multiple pieces in complicated tactical positions. You know, visualization is definitely a separate skill, but pretty much you'll visualize this position. And then you'll need to figure out which check works. So this knight is covering these 2 squares, and so if we can bring the knight here, that's actually checkmate, because all these squares are covered. So if we look at knight to g5, we see it doesn't necessarily work, and actually it leaves multiple options. King can move here, king can move here, king can move here. And so because of that, sometimes when you're evaluating piece movements in a line that result in a lot of options, it might be better to just go back and look if another move is more forcing, which knight to f6 is. So of course, after you decide to sacrifice your queen, you want to do a Blundercheck and clearly visualize all the lines and try to find any forcing moves that black has after you make this move, knight to f6. And there's really no other forcing moves. Because it's a double check, black can't take the bishop, and so it does result in a checkmate. Thanks for watching. This concludes day 5 double checks of my 28 Days to Better Chess Tactics. I'll give a quick recap of the 4-part thinking process. So in step 1, you want to find all the opponent's threats, basically all the aggressive replies. Just imagine if you skipped a move and it was your opponent's turn, to see what they would do. And so from there, after you understand your opponent's threats, you'll find the candidate moves in step 2. And I cover that in my 10-part strategic course, so you can watch that if you have any questions. It's pretty much just related to activity. You want to find all the forcing replies, look for the checks, captures, and threats, specifically when you're working on tactical positions. And so once you've found the candidate moves, you'll move to step 3, which is to calculate all the candidate moves until the end and determine the best line. And step 4 is just a Blundercheck, just to ensure that the move you decided doesn't lose something to the tactical shots of your opponent or any aggressive replies. And that just helps to ensure that you don't make any mistakes in a real game. Alright, so if you have any comments or questions, just leave it below in the comment section of this video, and I'll see you in day 6.